Willem, one thing I found out about you which I hadn't known before, that you appear to have been born in South Africa. Is that right?
That's right, yes. I think if it hadn't been for the Boer War, I wouldn't have existed.
How was that?
Well, my father, who was a curate in Bromsgrove, went out to do his bit and became a curate in Wynberg, where he met my mother, who was the daughter of Colonel John Eustace, who had gone out there to make his fortune after serving in the Crimean War. And there he met my mother, met his wife, and produced my mother, who married my father.
That was, you were born in 1905?
So I was born in about 1905. They were married about 1900 or so.
Yes.
They were rather pleased when she got married because they'd cleared off most of their unmarried daughters. She was the 13th child, and he had 6 sons and 7 daughters.
Wow.
And he was left with 2 daughters at that time. All the rest had married or cleared out. And my mother's sister, Monica Eustace, there'd been a bit of trouble about her because she'd very nearly got engaged to a man who had come out with his regiment, who was reputed to be the bastard son of King Edward VII. He wasn't King Edward, he was still the Prince of Wales, of course, then. But my grandfather, who wasn't taking any chances, got his elder sons, who were then high up in the Army and Navy abroad. He got them to make inquiries, and it turned out that the man was an impostor. That is to say, he wasn't a bastard.
He was a genuine legitimate person.
And they were only too pleased when my Aunt Monica met and married her first cousin, Henry Eustace, who'd come out with his regiment.
Jones sounds a Welsh name. Is it a Welsh family? Or?
Well, my father was Welsh. He came from a mining valley. He was the only one that didn't go down the mine and escaped from the valley, as it was put to me by one of his friends. 2 boys escaped. One became a British judge, and the other was my father, who went into the Church of England, having been originally brought up in a nonconformist Welsh valley.
So was he a missionary, or?
No, he wasn't a missionary. He merely served in Wynberg parish, which included a section for Africans who were then in the Cape, because he used to preach to them in Xhosa. He was a good linguist, and it was a pity when they decided later to move back to England.
What date was that they decided to move back?
Well, first of all, he got a job he moved from Cape Town to a place called Beaufort West, which was a little dorp on the edge of the Karoo, where they were engaged mainly in ostrich farming. Not for the eggs, but for the feathers, which, as you know, were in a
hot demand
requirement in those days for funerals and other purposes. But my mother couldn't stand the heat there, and so they decided to move back to England.
What date was that?
Oh, about 07, that sort of time, 1907,
so you were
7 or 8.
You were still very, very young.
So I was still very young, but my earliest memories date from Beaufort West rather than Cape Town.
What do you remember of that time?
Well, somebody getting Beaufort West, there were big water channels running down the main street. There was a dam there, and they let out water every so many days, and you channeled it off into your garden by blocking it as it came down. And I remember a great fuss and bother when they were celebrating Mafeking night, and one of the drunks got stuck in the water channel and was nearly drowned.
Yes.
That's about all I can remember of the place. We had a tortoise there, a giant one that I used to ride on. It had to be chained up.
It was a fierce
because
tortoise.
whenever it escaped, it used to go into the vegetable garden and eat all the lettuces and other brassicas, and wasn't very popular.
Yes. I hope we have a photograph of you on your giant tortoise riding at the age of 3.
Unfortunately not, but it still haunts me in my dreams pleasantly from time to time.
So you came back, your parents came back to England. Do you have any brothers and sisters?
No, I was an only child.
Hmm.
And when they came back, we stayed there for a bit, and then my mother showed signs of TB, and so my father decided to move abroad again. And he chose Antofagasta, Chile, because it was a nice dry climate, very suitable for TB people.
Hmm.
Before that, we went to Ireland and stayed on the old family estate of my uncle, where we lived in a remarkably medieval kind of Irish fortress affair, with no sanitation at all.
Do you remember anything about that?
Well, I remember a lot about that because we had, for example, a great deal of importance was attached in those days to bowel actions. And the children were sent out to the lavatories. These had been built in a palatial way as an accessory to the farmyard. And you went into a large chamber with an enormous seat on it with a series of holes of diminishing size. We were fitted onto the appropriate hole.
This was a joint one. I mean, there were
completely communal. We were all taken out after breakfast and dumped on these holes and left to perform in our own ways. And later on, the men, when they cleared out the stables, also came and cleared out these things at a considerable distance down below, because you were on a raise on a great height in this place, and the ground dropped off into the farmyard below. But the grown-ups had a special thunderbox, as they refer to it, which had been ordered from the Army and Navy. One of these little bucket latrine affairs, which was placed in the centre of the lawn for some unknown reason.
So anyone could see you going out to this?
Oh, well, we weren't allowed to go to it, only the grown-ups. So my mother and father and my uncle and aunt were the proud possessors, occupants of this one.
Yes. How long were you in Ireland for?
Only for about 6 months or less, I suppose.
And obviously indelibly impressed
That was the days when there were no motor cars. You went about in jaunting cars.
Jaunting cars?
You know what a jaunting car is?
No.
Well, it's drawn by one horse and it's a box, and you have seats. You sit back to back on these seats facing outwards.
Hmm.
And the driver sits in the front above the horse, and then behind him on each side, two or three people sit in a seat, and there's a well in the middle in which or you can dump your property.
I see. No, I haven't.
It's a kind of cart that you don't see anymore now.
This must have been during the First World War you were, or had it not started?
This was before the First
Just before.
World War.
Mm.
Because I went out to Chile for a long time before that and came back in 15.
So you went out to Chile in about 1911-12.
About 1911-12 to Antofagasta, which was a marvellous place.
Hmm. In what way was it marvellous?
Well, it was a complete desert, but beautifully cool at night, because you had a mist that came in from the sea.
Hmm.
And you couldn't grow anything there because the soil was so full of nitrate. And then in the hinterland behind the coastal mountains, you had more or less solid nitrate, which people dug up and put into a train and railed down to Antofagasta, the port, and then lighted it out to windjammers that carried it round the Horn back to Europe. They were just building the Panama Canal at the time, but these sailing ships went right round the Horn and did it that way.
Were there many British or English people there that your father had a curacy or?
Yes, my father was, believe it or not, a canon of the Diocese of the Falkland Islands.
Ah.
He never set foot on the place, but the Falkland Islands was the only British possession in South America, and the Bishop of the Falkland Islands had his base there, but spent all his time on liners which careered round the east and the west coast of South America.
relatively
You don't know who the bishop was? Wasn't the famous Bishop Sterling, who was the bishop at one time?
No, I was too young to remember any names of bishops and so on, but Sterling certainly I don't think was there then.
He was a relative of mine.
Oh, he was a relative of yours?
On my mother's side, yes. So, what schooling did you have?
Well, my father undertook my schooling and that of a few other English kids there who were destined for English public schools, preparing us for the sort of entrance examination.
And so he prepared you for that?
He prepared me for that, and prepared me too well. Because when I got to my public school, they were still using the old system of Latin pronunciation, whereas my father taught me the new system. And then they changed midway when I was in the school, so I got completely confused. And it can be very awkward when you're being tested in Latin orally. And you're asked what various things which can mean completely different words. Qui, quai, quod is pronounced one way. Quai, qui, quod is pronounced the same word in the other pronunciation. So I got completely tied up in my Latin.
What school did you go on to?
I went to St. John's, Leatherhead, and we sailed from South America for England in 1915. And I had my first experience of blackouts and U-boats and things of that sort.
Yes. It was a dangerous trip across.
Oh, very dangerous, because we had no escort. We had to just make it, and we had a complete blackout on the ship.
Why had your parents decided to come back in the middle of the war?
Well, to get me to school. And they didn't. This had been planned at a certain date, and then the war happened. And by the time they could get a boat to take us back, a year had elapsed. And I was about 11 and a half, because St. John's, Leatherhead, where I went to school, accepted people rather younger than some of the other schools.
Was your parents' idea to leave you there or to stay in England with you?
No, their idea was to leave me there and go back and visit me later as the opportunity offered. But I never saw them again for about 5 years.
No, because they did go back and they couldn't. Who did you spend your holidays with?
Well, I had a guardian who was my father's original vicar in South Africa, who had retired and become, or at least he left South Africa, and become the parson, I think they called it, or that is to say the manager of the Royal Liverpool Seamen's Orphanage in Newsham Park. And I stayed with him in Liverpool during the war. And until my parents came back and settled in England. And by that time I went out to West Africa.
What sort of man was he? Did you like him?
Oh yes, he was an interesting type. And he had an interesting job, of course. Looking after the orphans of Anglicans and Protestants were incarcerated in the orphanage. Roman Catholics were allowed to stay out because the Catholics objected, and he had the job of visiting their mothers and giving them grants and seeing that the kids were properly brought up in the Liverpool Irish Quarter.
So he was dealing professionally with orphans. Did you yourself feel somewhat of an orphan, having been left by your parents, or not?
Well, it was certainly a traumatic experience going to school for the first time, an only child and thoroughly spoiled. And I went there I arrived the second week of term, because I'd had to have my tonsils taken out in a hospital before I went to school, and that set me back, so that I was the only new boy at the time. But I solved that by going sick and going into the infirmary. And when I went back the next term, I was more or less on a level and had no further trouble.
You say you solved it. It sounds as if you decided to go sick and instructed your body to behave accordingly.
Well, I don't know, but I suppose it was psychosomatic, but anyhow it worked. I didn't do it, I used to do it later to avoid getting beaten. You could try and be sick and you went to the infirmary. And if you handled it properly, you could wangle the thermometer when the nurse was turned by putting it on the radiator beside you. If you put it on too long,
It
you
exploded.
had an absurd temperature. She spotted it.
Yes. Was it one of these schools where you had to be good at games in order to be popular and so on, or not?
Well, I got my popularity in another way. I got in. It's merely a matter of luck whether what sort of reputation you pick up, and I had a reputation of being undisciplined, and prefects were allowed to beat in those cases for minor offences, and so I was always being beaten, and that made me popular in an obscure kind of way.
It was worth it for the popularity to be beaten quite frequently. What sort of offences were? I can't imagine you with them.
Well,
Untidiness, being late.
untidiness, being late, being scruffy, breaking some minor rule that I've forgotten completely now.
Yes. What the trauma of I went through the same thing. My parents left me and went back to Assam and left me at a public school. And I remember being extremely lonely and missing them terribly, deeply. Did you have these? Were you close to your parents and missed
Well,
them?
I was close to my parents, but I don't think I was particularly lonely. And once I got adjusted to the school, that is in my second term, I had my friends, and we had a very happy time together.
So you enjoyed it? at school?
I enjoyed it. It was very rigorous because it was in the height of World War I, and rationing was in its infancy. And we were rationed to a pound of sugar a week. And whenever there was a riot in the East End, they took away our meat ration and sent it there. And those who had to cater for us had to do the best they could to feed us. But of course, we were fortunate in having what was then referred to as a communal kitchen, World War II British restaurant, where they were able to feed you on imported milks, foods and cheeses and things like that, which came from Holland and Denmark, which were not incorporated in the German organisation. So if you had any money, you could rush out in a break before lunch, fill yourself up with macaroni cheese, then come back to school, eat the school dinner for what it was worth, then dash out within half an hour of dinner and play a game of rugby football or something like that,
Yes.
and survive fairly well.
Survival of the richest, as usual. What were you particularly interested in at school? Were there any disciplines or hobbies that you...
Well, I had a good voice and I got into the choir, and that gave me a certain amount of satisfaction. But then the choir master, who was from King's here, was called up, and an old Duddery master took on the choir after that. And there was very little interest given to it after that, until this master, surprisingly enough, came back alive from the war after it and resuscitated it. But by that time my voice had broken.
And it wasn't as good a voice after it had broken?
Well, after it had broken, I didn't develop any decent voice. I became a so-called alto or countertenor, and then gravitated to bass. But it was a good choir. It sang in Westminster Abbey and various places like that.
Have you
And he was a damn good choir master.
retained your interest in music?
No, when I went up to Oxford, I was fed up with choirs, and I kept away from all music, I regret to say. Except, I think, Gershwin, because at that time, Rhapsody in Blue was being played in every college quadrangle. You couldn't get away from it.
So what about subjects? What you were beginning to specialise for university? What topics?
Well, I was again very lucky there, because the only subject they taught well at St John's was classics. We were the sons of it was a school founded for the sons of the poorer clergy. That was its full title.
Oh, I see.
The wealthier ones no doubt went to Lancing. And we got them from all over the place. Came in with weird accents from the north of Scotland and the darkest quarters of Wales and so on, but we turned them out with an impeccable Oxford accent. And to get them into Oxford or Cambridge, we had to teach them something, and they taught them classics very well. Well, I found that I couldn't compete with other people in classics, so I decided I would offer history. And some unfortunate master was forced to teach me some history. And they had to mark this. And of course, the classicists cancelled each other out. And my marks, nobody could compare me with anybody. And I ended up as top of the school in marks in my last year. And my name now is emblazoned
on the walls,
in conspicuous prominence in this particular area.
You enjoyed history though, as a subject?
No, I didn't particularly, but it was a subject. And when I went up to Oxford to apply, I put in for a Welsh scholarship at Jesus on the strength of my Welsh ancestry. And I suppose I got in on the strength of my essay, which dealt with classical matters. But anyhow, when I showed it to the master when I got back at school, he said, well, hang on to it, whatever you do, you won't get anything else anywhere.
Encouraging.
So I decided not to apply for Cambridge, but stuck to Jesus Oxford.
So when did you go up to Oxford? What year was this?
Well, I went up in 23.
Your parents had now come back?
My parents came back, no, they came back in 24, 25, that sort of time.
So
but I was still with the Guardian.
So
and by that time, yes, they came back, and my father had to begin all over again. And he went into the Church of Wales this time and was a curate at Colwyn Bay until he got a living in a place called Eglis Bar.
And they stayed in England from
And they remained from England after that.
Yes. How did you find Oxford just after well, it was a bit after the war, wasn't it? It was 5 years after the war. Did you enjoy? Well,
I enjoyed Oxford because by then I'd grown sufficiently strong to be able to play games, and I was involved in the college rugger and so on. It was a place that divided itself very much into hearties and aesthetes. I was neither. Harold Acton was one of the principal aesthetes. I don't remember the hearties. And I soon got playing for the London Welsh.
Did you?
Because in those days, most of the London clubs relied for most of their players on Oxford and Cambridge. And there was a general exodus on Saturday. People from both universities, if they couldn't get into the two university teams, they found their way up to London and played for the various London ones. And I went up to the London Welsh.
And you played for the London Welsh. That's quite a distinction.
Played for the London Welsh. We had a Jones 3/4 line. It was very convenient having the name Jones, because you could be sure they'd get your initials wrong, and even if they didn't, you could bluff it out, because the president of Jesus objected very much to his young men wasting their time out of Oxford, and you could only get a couple of exeats a term to go to London. Well, one just ignored that and went. And he and his wife, because he was partially blind, used to read the papers. The sporting side of some of the London papers then used to publish the full teams of the London clubs, and he would see which of his young men were playing. Well, he never recognised me.
Your initials were always wrong.
I was always a Jones, and he gave up Jones.
What position did you play?
3/4. As I say, we had a Jones 3/4 line.
Which one? Centre or
wing usually, because I was fast.
And then at that time, Oxford, presumably the history tripos was 3 years, and with all the examinations at the end of the 3 years.
Yes, well, I wanted to go abroad again, and I thought I hadn't heard of the colonial service but I knew about the consular, so I wanted to switch to languages. But my college wouldn't let me. Quite rightly, they said, you can't possibly. We are a college where we only allow our students to read for honours. In those days, in the university, would either read for honours or for a past degree. And a lot of people in other colleges were reading in past degrees, but Jesus insisted on efficiency and scholarship.
And you couldn't do an honours in modern
Well, I
languages?
couldn't have done an honours in French and German or any language because I hadn't got any language, and I'm very bad at languages anyway. So after taking past moderations, which the first exam was called, I had to switch to history.
I see. Who were your teachers? Do you remember?
Well, my only famous one was a man called Gronwy Edwards, who eventually ended up at the Record
Public
Office.
Record Office, you see.
And I owe a great deal to him because we had one pair. I took early history rather than modern history because there were fewer books to read. And he covered one paper called Stubbs' Charters, and a man called Stubbs wrote a book and produced a whole lot of charters. Well, I never read the book from cover to cover, but we attended his lectures, and his lectures were so organised.
This is Gronwy Edwards, is
This was Gronwy Edwards.
Not Stubbs's. Yes.
Not Stubbs, no, Stubbs is dead a long time ago. But Gronwy Edwards' lectures were such that he covered every question those who sat in the exams could possibly think up. It's rather difficult thinking about original questions on Stubbs' charters. And Gronwy had them covered. So you went to his lectures and you copied them down straight off. And you could guarantee that the examiners would have thought up one or two new questions, but you'd have a whole lot of questions you could get through. Well, there was no problem in that paper. I got an alpha in that paper without any difficulty, without any work, apart from copying it down and memorising it. But I passed in history. And then I found that you could get into the colonial service. I would have liked to have gone to the Sudan because the leave was better and the pay was better. But the Sudan was so popular that only blues and people with great ability could get into it. As you know the old story, the Sudan was where the blues ruled the blacks.
Blues being the
Cambridge. Oxford and Cambridge blues. I never achieved a blue either. I wasn't good enough or large enough for that.
What had made you decide you wanted to go into the colonial service or the...
Well, because I couldn't, as I thought, get into the consular service. And it did take you abroad and it seemed attractive. And I put in for the West African section because, again, the pay was better and the leave was better.
What sort of pay and what sort of leave do you remember?
I don't remember the pay, but it was very small by modern standards. And the leave was worked out at every 18 months.
Sort of 3 months back in...
Well, it meant that by the time you got back to England, it took you 14 days by boat and 14 days back again to Nigeria, so it was about a month. So it worked out roughly, and 4.5 months leave. So it worked out at 18 months, then half a year, and then back again.
Did West Africa still have the reputation for being climatically and health-wise very dangerous?
Well, I didn't realise at the time that there was no cure for for yellow fever. They invented one while I was out there. But I didn't know about that. But I didn't think about disease in those days. I had been in Africa before and I didn't mind getting back there.
Do you remember the interview you had for the... presumably they interviewed you to see whether you were an appropriate person
No, I don't remember much about the interview. All I remember was I was looking for various jobs abroad. And I also put in at the same time for a job in the Bombay Burma Teak Company. And I went to that interview before I went for the Colonial Office interview. And I sort of tossed up as to which I'd take. Well,
You were offered both, were you?
I was offered both, yes. But I bought a pair of gloves for the Bombay teak interview. And I left them in the taxi afterwards. And so having lost the gloves, I thought that was a bad omen, and I planked from West Africa.
On a pair of gloves, your whole future life hinged.
Well, it sounded very attractive, the Bombay-Burma thing. You disappeared into the teak forest with elephants in the right time of the year, and then you emerged the wrong time and spent the rest of the time drinking in the clubs or wherever it was where you organised the sending of teak to this country.
Yes, it sounds very like George Orwell, sort of Burmese days world. When you got to West Africa, what were you assigned to do?
When I went to West Africa, I went straight into the administrative service, and I became an acting ADO. That is to say, I was an ADO in all but in official name and in salary.
ADO is an assistant district officer.
In the old days, they used to be commissioners. Then they decided to call us officers instead.
Yes.
But the locals always referred to as DC.
And where did you go first?
Well, I was posted to a place called Penny.
This was in Nigeria.
This was in eastern Nigeria. You arrived in Lagos, and it was they'd suddenly managed to recruit in a big way from Nigeria and the Gold Coast. And the boat that took us out had about 150 or more cadets on it. And we had a splendid time amongst ourselves, and everybody else avoided us like the plague. And we were a slightly different breed to the older coasters and administrators, because previously they'd recruited mainly from the army. Now Sir Rafe Furs at the Colonial Office had persuaded them it was better to have people who were varsity trained, and we were mainly university undergraduates, plus one or two ex-army people who had managed to get in, or people from World War I, you see, who were looking for a job.
Was there resentment among the old army people about this new university-trained group coming in, or not?
No, the resentment that I found when I went out there amongst my colleagues was against those who had been recruited in 1914-15 and were in a higher position to the young men who had been enlisted in the army and then come out to Nigeria and been taken on then, who found themselves in inferior positions to these people who were put in a category called 1915ers. And you found, or at least I found when I went out there, that my residents in the eastern region were 1915ers. My dears were people who'd been in World War I and were captains and commanders and so on, and were very resentful of the people immediately above them.
I see. Had you had any language training or any sort of training before you arrived there, or did you do transport?
Well, I went on a colonial services course, and I was told on this course that I should read about, I was going to be posted to eastern Nigeria, and I should read about the Ibibio and learn the Ibibio, read about the Igbo and learn the Ibibio language.
Yes, you used the word Ibibio. What is?
Well, there were two tribes, totally different, speaking totally different languages, of course. And I was posted not to an Igbo division, but to an Ibibio division. And eventually I passed an Ibibio language exam. I passed it primarily because the man that took the exam was in the Scottish mission there, with a very strong Scottish accent, a man called McGregor. and that just came right through in the dictation. So although Ibibio is a tonal language, I could get it absolutely perfectly with a Scotch accent. I never spoke the language again, and after that I was always posted to Igbo divisions.
Total waste of time.
But nobody bothered about native languages in southern Nigeria because there were so many about the place, and the lingua franca was English. The better class spoke proper English or Barbaro English, and the marketplace you spoke Pidgin English, which is a lovely, colourful language.
What books was it suggested that you read at that time? Who were the authorities on?
Oh, they didn't say. They said read books about the Igbo. Well, there weren't any books about the Igbo, at least. Oh yes, there were Talbot, but they weren't called. They weren't actually about many Igbo, and as far as I can make out, Talbot's interpreters, even when he was in an Igbo area, were Ijaw people. However,
so did you read them? This was Amori.
Oh no, I didn't bother to read them because the Colonial Services exam tried to cram you with about 5 or more different key subjects in the space of about a couple of terms. Law, colonial history, tropical medicine, tropical agriculture. I've forgotten the other ones, but we were supposed to master all these, and we merely attended a course of lectures and then sat an exam. And none of the things that one got on the course did one follow up very much. But what it had the effect of doing was to familiarise you with what some of these experts who came out later thought they were doing in the agricultural or engineering or legal line.
What sort of role did people think you were to play in West Africa? Was it the idea that the white man's burden, that you were to maintain the status quo and to administer justice and so on, or?
Well, we were never lectured on what our role should be. The people who did this were the Belgians and the French. They believed very much in telling you how you ought to behave. But they couldn't very well tell us what our role should be because we were on a colonial services course going out to anywhere, from the Gilbert and Ellis down to the Caribbean or anyone else, you see. So they couldn't tell us exactly what you'd meet when you got out in the colony.
Had to be very general.
And you were expected to find out when you got there.
What did you find out when you got there? What did you think your role was when you...
Well, a very pleasant role really, of trying to reconcile the friction between the people in your division and the government higher up. You would get an order from the government telling you to do something, and it either could be done or it couldn't be done. It was up to you to try and find out and put it over to the people under you. You were also responsible for keeping order in your division, and one got the impression that people were very grateful to you for doing so in the eastern region, because there previously there had been no overall authority, and when we came in, every little village was in a state of armed neutrality or more active hostility with its neighbour. And from the 19th century onwards, the British consul had been intervening in the disputes between the people in the coastal states, trying to settle the differences and then drawing a treaty about it.
What sort of orders did you receive from above you and had to try and carry out at the local level?
Well, what the way it worked was that somebody would raise a question, shall we say, in the Houses of Parliament, wanting to know about somebody being flogged, shall we say. Well, a very emotive term. And you would then find yourself faced with a return for the Nigerian Blue Book, which listed the amount of cases of flogging in each colonial territory. And you were asked in your division to send a return of flogging. Well, you just either invented figures, or you said that nobody is flogged in this division. And if you used the word flogging in the local dialect, you'd find that flogging merely meant hitting. In a case, for instance, a man would say, "He flogged me." How did he flog you? He flogged me for eye. In other words, he hit him in the eye. On the other hand, if you went up to northern Nigeria, you got flogging as part of the initiation of Fulani boys and so on. Mm. And in the prisons, of course, you were flogged with a British cat and nine-tail. It was a punishment there.
Mm. But it didn't happen very much in the area.
Well, we had no flogging.
Mm.
But the reactions to flogging were very different. In northern Nigeria, they took it for granted and didn't think anything of it in the prisons and so on. In the eastern region, the idea of a person being beaten like that horrified them and shocked them completely because they'd never experienced anything like it.
Mm.
And our various returns used to be merely a matter of concocted by the district officers.
Mm.
You just put a few figures in.
What was your you said one of your main roles was as a kind of justice of the peace, magistrate. What kind of cases did you have to adjudicate on?
Well, the colonial judicial system was very complicated because you had, first of all, the Supreme Court of Nigeria where only judges, specialised judges featured. You had the ordinary provincial courts, which was still under the judicial department, where you had judges and magistrates. Then you had the so-called native courts, and where the local people tried their own cases and administered native law and custom, except where it conflicted with British ideas of justice and equity or some term like that, which meant that you couldn't try a witchcraft case. In a native court you merely called it using bad medicine, or you got round it in that way.
So you had these two levels, and in which level were you involved?
Well, you were involved in you were magistrate. You were gazetted as a magistrate in the provincial court. As such, you could try cases in the ordinary Nigerian courts, which admitted barristers, lawyers to plead. And you also could review or hear on appeal cases that were heard in the native court. Anybody tried in the native court and sentenced to imprisonment would have to, his case had to be reviewed by an administrative officer before he could be admitted to the prison. So what you found yourself landed with was a whole lot of court messengers bringing in a whole lot of prisoners with the judgment books, which were written by the court clerks in English, because it's the only language they knew how to write anyway. And you read through the case, and if it looked okay, you let the man go into prison.
And if you didn't look okay?
If you didn't look okay, well then you sent it back to the court and said, I will review, let this man go back on bail. Or if it was a serious case, you had him detained in the prison and you went out and reviewed the case.
And in that case, would you have the hearing on your own? He would just come and you would question him? Or would you do it in a court setting?
Well, if I would do it in a court setting. And in some of the divisions in the eastern region, native courts were so popular because they were very cheap and lawyers could not appear in them, that you heard about 40 or more cases a day, and you'd be spending about 2 or 3 weeks hearing them.
Mm.
What about the noise? It's bedlam. It's absolute bedlam.
We've got to ask you about the noise that went on in the court, Gwilym.
Oh.
I mean, our vision of a court is, silence and one person speaking at a time.
Yeah, it was a very interesting proceedings, really. You'd go to the court, and when you reviewed a case, you'd have the people before you, you'd ask them questions, and you'd ask the bench questions about it. And the court, there'd be a large audience, because it was the only sort of amusement, local amusement going, and there'd be dead silence. As soon as you'd heard the evidence and given your judgment, you said, I set this aside, or I altered it to so and so and so and so, and you pronounced that, everybody started talking at once, discussing it. And while you carefully wrote down in the book, as briefly as you could, your confirmation or your alteration of the sentence.
Hmm. So it was like the end of a football game or something.
And you could get the feel of whether you were right or wrong in your decision, from the noise in the court.
Was a lot of noise a good sign or a bad sign?
Well, it depended on the kind of noise.
Hmm.
Some noises were noises of approbation, yes.
Hmm.
They were watching to see whether this would happen, because what you were looking out for was where the judges had been got at.
Hmm.
And they'd given what was a judgment that was quite contrary to the facts.
Hmm. How was it possible to adjudicate in these kind of very intricate cases without a detailed knowledge of the social structure, customs, culture of the people?
Well, where you didn't know about it, you could ask questions.
Hmm.
And the great thing about Igbos and Ibibios compared to Northerners was that they were quite ready to say and to answer back. Northerners, particularly in the Hausa country, were scared stiff of what they would say, because the news would get back to the emir or some of their chiefs as to what they were saying, and they'd get it in the neck if they hadn't said the right thing.
Hmm.
But there, when in a meeting, for instance, you could get at the facts very easily, because one side would make their statement and the other side would immediately rush in and say, that's a bloody lie. It's like this. And you play them off against each other and get at the truth that way.
Hmm. Do you remember any particular case or cases which particularly either intrigued you or worried you? Were there any that you still remember?
I remember quite a lot of amusing cases.
Hmm.
I remember one case, I can give you a copy of it. I took a copy of it. I didn't hear this case, but I was waiting and looking through an old judgment book, and I found that the court, while they were waiting for people to turn up, had decided to guy a native court case, and they prosecuted a number of frogs for creating disturbance in the native court compound. And they got court messengers to give certain evidence which was recorded against the frogs, and you got somebody else speaking on behalf of the frogs and giving their case, and you got the judgment, and it was a complete replica of a typical native court case.
Were the frogs found guilty or not?
The frogs were found, no, they were found it was their custom to make a noise when it rained. And therefore,
it was the act of a reasonable frog.
it was a perfectly good judicial decision was given on this. They were not breaking the law, because it was only reasonable for frogs to make a noise when it rained.
Oh, that's nice.
But I remember another case. The charge went £5 damages for deformation of character by saying that plaintiff played at harlots with mission teachers for cups of tea. Which meant that a young woman was it made her fiancé take an action out on her behalf because her friends were saying that she was flirting with mission teachers.
Very nice.
Or another one, £5 damages for taking so-and-so to such and such a town and where with view to marriage, and then not marrying her, wasting plaintiff's time.
Yes, breach of promise of a kind, yes.
But the great thing about being a district officer in my day was that there were no telephones, which meant that you were on the spot and you had to make a decision. And if anybody sent anything through to you, it had to come by telegram, and people think twice, even in the bureaucracy, before they send a telegram. And you'd get a telegram, and all you need to do to that would be to send another telegram back. Your so-and-so received, usual action taken. Well, the chances were that the recipient was not prepared to admit that he didn't know what the usual action was and would leave it at that. If, on the other hand, he didn't, then he'd say, please wire what action taken. You could then have time to write a memorandum explaining why you couldn't do anything.
Or you could say the telegram.
Or you could hurry up and do something and send it back.
So you were really very much on your own.
You were on your own as a district officer. You had to make the decision, and it didn't really matter what decision you made, provided you made one. And it was a relatively sensible one. And in a land case, for instance, there wasn't any accurate judicial decision because nobody knew where the boundaries were. All you had to do was to say, this is the boundary. And then at least they had something to go on.
And they accepted it. I mean, when you said this is the boundary, then people would say...
Well, they would accept it for the time being, and depending on other causes usually, they might reactivate it. Young men, for instance, from one side might be taunting young men at the other side, saying you lost the case. And then they probably go and try and raise some more money and fight the case again, or raise it again. The trouble with land cases was, if they got from the native court into the protectorate court, lawyers came in, and then they went on appealing these cases higher and higher until they got right up to the West African Court of Appeal. And the people raised the money to pay the lawyers and beggar themselves.
Were people beginning already to use law as a threat against their adversaries, threatening to take them to law and thereby to impoverish them, or not? This happened in many parts of the world.
Don't be mistaken. Africans, or at least the Africans I dealt with, are very much better acquainted with the niceties of law and what you can do and not do to right your wrongs than most Englishmen or Europeans. They have to be on the guard to know what they can do and how they can, what are their remedies for righting wrongs. And they appreciated judicial decisions. The noise in the court that you got, if you gave the right decision, would instance that.
Because Edmund Leach, describing law in Sri Lanka, for example, he described it in a phrase. He said it was the favourite village sport. And your account of the sort of roar that came up at the end of the game, so to speak, it was the appreciation of an art form.
It was, absolutely.
And you found the same thing.
Because you have a number of different ways in an Igbo village, shall we say, rather than African, of righting your wrongs, depending what the wrong is. You can either settle the matter at home by going to an elder and asking him to settle the case for you. It'll cost you some money, but it won't cost you very much. And if your opponent is prepared to do the same, well, you can settle it in this way. I don't call it arbitration because they didn't. It was considered settling a case. If he won't do that, you can then take out action in the native court. And in that case, you can get to accept or not the judgment of the native court. If you don't accept the judgment, you can then write a petition to the district officer asking him to review the case. If the district office, if you don't like the district officer's review, you're at liberty, if you want to write to the resident above him and ask him to review the case. And if you don't like the resident's decision, you can go right up and ask the governor to intervene and so on. You don't get many going as far as the governor, but you've got quite a number of residents. Appeals up to the resident or reviews up to the resident.
As you know, there's been a famous discussion or argument in the study of African legal systems between two schools. The school of Max Gluckman, which argued that the basis of legal process in African, particularly in Central African courts, was very similar to that in Western societies. It just looks rather different on the surface. It was based on the same ideas of the reasonable man and so on. And the other view of Paul Bohannon and others that TIV justice anyway was very, very dissimilar. The whole, because it was embedded within their society, it was very difficult to translate out of their concept into our own, and therefore each legal system is very different. Did you, from your experience, did you come down on one side or other in that debate?
Well, I think that I would say it's more a matter of two people going to two extremes. Rarely the two go together. But in the Barotse situation, you've got people who are expected to know about the law and to judge cases and so on. Whereas amongst the TIV, it's much more a matter of consensus and a lot of people talking together and then deciding what to do. And therefore, the judgment is likely to be a bit more fluid and depend less on particular cases, previous cases. And it's not going to be a matter of case law, it's going to be a matter of what are we going to do at the moment to settle this thing. I think it's more like that.
So what they were looking at was really rather different in the...
They were looking at two different societies.
And different levels of institutionalization.
The last thing that the TIV can tolerate is anybody in authority over him. And they like to get together and talk about things. And as you know, anybody who has any authority in the TIV is a witch. They're good witches, bad witches, but you've got to tolerate them.
Did you come across, turning to witchcraft, did you come across witchcraft beliefs at all in your...
Oh, any number of them, but you've got a big difference between Igbo and most other people, Cross River, Yoruba and other people. Igbos know all about witchcraft, but they say they don't suffer from it. In other words, they stick together more closely and they're much less likely to be paranoid about their relatives persecuting them and so on.
So you weren't asked to adjudicate in witchcraft cases? You weren't allowed officially anyway, but in some disguised form it didn't come up?
Well, what you were involved in was to accuse a person of being a witch was a criminal offence under the Nigerian code, because it was a form of political warfare in Calabar and places like that. If you accused a person of being a witch, he had to take poison to prove he wasn't, and if he vomited it in time, he was proved right.
Poison oracle.
And we got a whole lot of cases in my early days of anti-witch movements which worked like that. There was a case in Calabar, for instance, where two young men were filled with the Holy Ghost from a Christian mission, and they were maintained by a local chief, and they were hired out by him to go out smelling out witches in various villages, and then they would be brought in, and the witnesses would say how they had been identified by these people as a witch. They had taken the poison, they had recovered.
What was your role in that?
Well, my role in that would be prosecuting the chief and the young men, but in particular the chief who was employing them, for breaking the Nigerian criminal law.
Mm.
But there were other witchcraft cases, movements in which, as they carefully pointed out to, it didn't break the law. They didn't. You got special medicines which you brought to the town.
Mm.
All the people came and swore and drank the medicine. It was then shoved up in a stick, and various lines were taken from it, so that you had to walk under an archway and be infected by it. But if you were a witch and went out at night time, this anti-witchcraft medicine called infam would catch you, and you would die. Your head would be taken back, and you'd run at the nose, and you gradually, unless you could find and sacrifice a white sheep in time, you would be killed by this medicine. Well, when we went into this, it coincided very nicely with an outbreak of cerebrospinal meningitis, which was being spread round this area by a village that had just got this medicine and was passing it on to different villages. I spoke to a particular, I was waiting at a meeting, and I asked them, I said, have you got, I gather you've got this medicine called infam, because I'd seen it as I came in. He said, oh yes. I said, does it work? Oh, he said, yes, very well. I said, well, how many witches has it killed? And he said, oh, 7. And then I said, how does it work? And then he told me the full details that I've told you here. When I got back to the station, I checked in with the medical statistics and so on, and I found that 9 people had died of cerebrospinal meningitis in this particular village.
So 2 different causes have been given for the same symptoms. That's very nice.
But you could have an awful trouble with imitative people with witchcraft.
Mm. Yes, Laura Bohannon describes some of that, doesn't she?
Yes. Well, there was a man called McBride that had told me a particular case where a young man comes back from work and finds his brothers died. He's been told that he's been killed by the witchcraft of the witches in this area. And he complains to the police, and the police round up a number of people who he accuses, and they confess to having done it. The other old man says, yes, I did it, and goes into full details of how they killed this man by poison, then the body was buried, then they came along in a witchcraft cabal and they dug it up and they cut it into pieces and they shared it all out, and he got the so-and-so. And so they said, well, anyhow, before we can go on with this trial, we must have some indication of the body. There must be some bits and pieces left. They sent out a policeman to go and bring it in. Came back with a perfectly intact body. And then the DO turned to this man who just confessed to doing all this, and he said, how do you explain this? He said, well, you don't understand. That was our witchcraft. Well, he said, you're in a nice position when you get that sort of thing. Mm. And as far as the poison is concerned, well, you can't prove that he was killed by poison because A, nobody knows much about the tiered poisons, and B, even if you get bits and pieces of this man to the government analyst at Lagos, by the time they arrive there, they'll be pretty high, and the man will not know what the hell it is anyway.
Mm.